Thank you so much for joining us on this wintry day to discuss a very important topic. As you can see, the session is being recorded, and we hope that we can share the slides with you afterwards with Prof Lyn's permission, of course. So we'll check with her first, but at least then you'll have access to the recording. So thank you so much for joining us. So my name is Clarissa Robertson, and I would like to introduce Professor Lyn Horn to all of you, and just to initiate this important discussion. Prof Lyn Horn is the director of the Office of Research Integrity at UCT, and she's also an extraordinary professor, associate professor in the Center for Applied Ethics at Stellenbosch University. And in her current role, she is responsible for promoting responsible research practice, including responsible conduct of research, education, and training. And she's been working in the fields of research ethics and integrity for over 20 years. And she's also served as the Research Integrity Officer at Stellenbosch from 2011 to 2016. She's a member of the governing board of the World Conference on Research Integrity, a very exciting conference that is again taking place in 2026 in Vancouver. So please keep your eyes on notifications for that. And she was the South African co-chair for the 7th World Conference on Research Integrity in 2022 that was hosted in Cape Town. And she was actually part of the author team in the development of this Cape Town statement that she will be speaking to today. So just some housekeeping before we let Lyn start. Please keep your cameras and your microphones off during the presentation. We'll have some time after the presentation for questions and discussions, but you are welcome to share your thoughts, your questions, or your reactions in the chat, which I will be moderating. Lyn, we appreciate your time and your sharing your insights and your experiences with our colleagues and our students today. Thank you so much. You may go ahead and share your presentation.
Okay. Thanks so much, Clarissa, for that generous introduction. Let me just try and get this right. Oh, goodness.
We're here to help, Lyn, so I'll let you know once we can. Yes, I can see your presentation, so you can
just get it into presentation mode. There you go.
There we go.
Is that okay? You can see that. Let me just close this down. Yeah.
That's perfect. We can only see your presentation in display mode, so that's great. We can see it. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm going to talk about the Cape Town Statement on fostering research integrity through equity and diversity, and particularly Clarissa asked me to focus a little bit on its relevance for researchers. So I'm just trying to minimize this, and I'm not having a success. Just give me a second, if you don't mind. No. Anyway, okay. This is just to acknowledge that the statement did come with a lot of support, and the conference out of which it came also had a lot of support. So I'm going to talk about why the statement, why did we feel it was important to have this statement coming out of a research integrity conference, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about linking equity, fairness, diversity in research to research integrity, because there've been a lot of statements and guidelines and various things around research collaborations, and new ones come out all the time, and I could have actually included some of them in this presentation, which I haven't, but there certainly are a lot. And I think what was different with the Cape Town Statement was making this issue of fairness, research fairness, a research integrity issue, and trying to show that there are very, very important links. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll look at a closer look at the Cape Town Statement, particularly looking at the statements that are of particular relevance to researchers, and then I will end off with just a few practical recommendations on how researchers can leverage this statement, especially in a time which we know we're all living in, which is unprecedented in terms of attack on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity from major funders. And so it just, we know that researchers need the funding, and yet and so this is becoming almost a moral issue. Do we, in order to get that funding, do we just look away from what we know to be really important things, particularly within our South African context? So I have to admit that this journey to the Cape Town statement was quite a personal journey for me in a way. I think, although of course I wasn't by any means the only author of it, and it was a very collaborative process. But for me, I had been working, one of my initial experiences was working as an ethicist, actually at Stellenbosch University as part of the Desmond Tutu Foundation Research Institute in the Department of Pediatrics. And I did that for a while, and it was just such an interesting thing to me. And then also traveling to meetings, the HIV Prevention Trial Network meetings in Washington, and just, yeah, sitting there, I was still quite new to this whole idea, and sitting there and thinking and listening to all of these talks given by Ivy League university, Yale, Harvard, whatever, that were always the lead PIs. And we were sitting as the Africans in the audience listening. And I was thinking, and yet all of this research was happening in Africa and elsewhere. And I know that a lot has changed, and that we now, especially at Stellenbosch University and at UCT, we have wonderful PIs that are really leading, although they've now had a lot of their research funding or about to have research funding cut, but are real leaders in the field. So this is not across the board, but certainly it is there. And for investigators in other African countries, it is very much a reality. I also got funding at one point. I worked with Professor Mariana Kruger, also from Stellenbosch, who was the head of the Department of Pediatrics, and we worked together. We had funding from the EDCTP to develop a book, Research Ethics in Africa, and that was so interesting because part of that funding was bringing research ethics people from, I think, 11 countries in Africa together at Stellenbosch, at Steers actually, and to listen to their stories of research and research unfairness, and it was a real eye-opener for me. And then the other thing that I've done, sorry, I just need a bit of water, which I have. The other thing that I have also done is over the years I've been EU funders often require independent ethics advisors on North-South collaborative projects, and I've done quite a number of them over the last 10 years. I've just got onto another one around food security, and that has really given me a kind of a at the coalface look at these collaborations and how they work, and they're important, but it's also given me a lot of insight into some of the issues. And then I think that the thing that really triggered was that the Council of Health Research and Health CORID, Council on Health Research and Development, for a period of time was promoting the Research Fairness Initiative, where they were trying to get institutions to actually do an internal quality assurance process and looking at their practices, particularly as they related to downstream. So we all know that you often get a big research grant, and you may actually then have sub-award processes, sub-award grantees in other parts of Africa, but looking at and processes, particularly research management processes, and looking at how fair they were. And this was also a real eye-opener to me. And along all of this were some of the problems that have articulated by low and middle income researchers that I have heard and had reported to me over these periods of time. And I also, what I didn't say right at the beginning is that I have given many talks on the Cape Town Statement. I think obviously since it was published in 2023, there's been a lot of interest. So I do apologize if you have attended previous talks, because I haven't been able to produce a completely new set of slides every time I talk. So there are slides in this presentation that have been used previously. So this was just a list of some of the problems that are articulated, that local research priority setting is overlooked, that these collaborations exist with unsurfaced power imbalances, that often there's a lack of explicit role definition, that sometimes local PIs have expressed that they just feel like glorified data collectors. There can be lack of resources or capacity to manage or analyze big data. And then all issues around open science and data sharing pressure, which can become a real double-edged sword, I think, for low and middle income researchers. Lack of mentorship, lack of career development grants, whereas we know that in other parts, EU and the US particular, there are huge grants that support researchers that mentorship grants that support researchers in their career development. And often our researchers have to have so many competing commitments. They have to teach, they've got to do admin, they've got to take on leadership positions very early in their careers. And, that if I'm not going to mention any names, but if I just look at some of the people that are sitting in deans and deputy dean positions, and they're real bright up and coming researchers, and I think, oh dear, why they have to carry all of this burden at this stage of their career. And then I think from Stellenbosch and UCT, we have nice big research offices with lots of support, but that's not the case all over in elsewhere in many other institutions, both in South Africa and certainly further afield in Africa, that these support systems that you have to have in place to manage budget and financial administration and reporting and fair contracting and data protection and all of this kind of thing. There's a whole engine room of systems that are required to enable cutting edge research to continue, and often there isn't funding or capacity for that. So another problem is obviously also poor funding of research by African governance, and meaning that we have to then rely on funding from further afield, and of course forex issues that are seen as very unfair. So this article was published actually just after the Cape Town Statement was published in Nature. This was published as a kind of a follow-up, and it is an interesting article, and I like the title, Pack Up the Parachute, Why Global North-South Collaborations Need to Change. And it focused on four very interesting case studies from around the world. And if you're interested in the topic, it's definitely worth having a read. So just to focus a little bit on the link between research equity and fairness and research integrity. So why is unfairness and equity in research a research integrity issue? So these are just some of the areas of negative impact in the research life cycle. And I think the first one is research priority and agenda setting. And I've experienced this myself, that you've got sometimes imposed agendas, and that the grant has already been written and the funding has been already obtained, and now sometimes you've got researchers from high income countries that because they have to look for or they need to, in order to do the research. They bring LMIC collaborators on at quite a late stage, and that can sometimes mean that agendas are already set and they're already imposed, and that can lead to the deprioritizing of important research questions. And an example, one of the where I was an advisor on a big clinical trial, and I can't give too many details because of, of confidentiality issues, but this study has been completed and it has been published, and I think it produced a lot of very good information. But it was a study that was conducted where the lead organization was in Europe and the sites were in Mozambique, Tanzania, and I think Malawi. And the endpoints in the clinical trial were not reached. And I think it was because there were issues, they were related to practices and taboos that the local investigators were very aware of, but didn't seem to have been able to articulate as to how much these issues were going to affect the study. And to me, that's just an example of where the investigator, the funding had been got from the HIC investigators, and they had already set the research questions, and there wasn't funding to actually address some of these underlying issues, which at the end of the day actually upended the outcomes of the study. So also, in terms of funding, we have arduous due diligence requirements that are often only imposed on foreign recipients, and sometimes there can be lack of funding for indirect costs of research, etc. And cost cutting in budgets can lead to shortcuts and can lead to problems, I think, in research. I've had first-hand example where I couldn't say for definite that it was because of tight budgets, but there definitely seemed to have been an indication that short contracts for community field workers had, due to tight budgets in a particular context, had led to a whole lot of shortcuts that even included some level of data fabrication. And then, of course, we all know about authorship and publication and lack of fair acknowledgement and leaving authors off authorship lines, or not actually valuing the knowledge and the contribution that they've made. I think another area is data collection, analysis and storage. So funder requirements or lead PI requirements often mean that data is hosted on servers at centers in the global north. So certainly I've had that experience in where I've been the ethics advisor, and the data is immediately uploaded right from the clinic sites, rural clinic sites, uploaded onto servers that are sitting somewhere else in Europe. And so it might be that for secondary data analysis or follow-up studies of the data, that there is an inability by the local investigators who actually collected the data to then do these follow-up studies that might then be able to answer some of their local priority questions. And this was just a quote from an article about the MORU, which is the Oxford University Tropical Medicines Research Unit, just basically saying that although all of this data is collected in LMICs, to this date, they've actually, all the request for data come from well-resourced groups from high income settings who've got good IT infrastructure and the capacity to conduct complicated statistical analysis and mathematical modeling, and that there have been absolutely no requests from the countries from where the data was actually collected. So yeah, and I think you probably know it can be a good thing, but there can also be a real pressure to get to share data very early in the study, put it on platforms, and this may impede the ability for local researchers to do additional secondary analyses. In other words, they don't have an embargo period, which is fair, to have a first bite at the data that they've actually collected. And better resources from HRCs then can be more agile. And then there's also the issue with if you're getting people that don't have a good understanding of the community and the context and the environment in which the data was collected, can produce articles that are quite biased or interpreted incorrectly. So these are all issues related to fairness issues related to research data. And of course, inadequate support systems can then result in data being stored and protected suboptimally, and this has the potential for data breaches, which we definitely don't want to have to deal with. I'm not going to talk about this, but I think open science is certainly a pillar of research integrity. If you look at the statements that have been put out, the Hong Kong statement by the World Conferences over the while, there's a lot of push and a lot of emphasis on how important open science is for research integrity. But there are a lot of barriers. So basically, that to gold open access costs a lot of money, and although there are a lot of various license agreements. I just attended recently, just 2 weeks ago, a presentation from Wiley. These various license agreements, in order to try and improve the situation, it still remains a problem where the funds that universities have for article processing costs, APCs, in comparison to the number of articles that the institution, but I'm sure both yours and mine, publish on a year, that only covers a very small portion. And so the majority of the research is published in the traditional subscription journals, and these mean that you've got research. Our previous DVC gave me the example of how she can only publish. She was an engineer working in water and water safety and water security, that she can only publish 1 out of 5 articles in a gold open access journal, and the rest are published in subscription-based journals. But that means that often researchers and other places in Africa that would really need to access this research, it's behind a paywall, because they don't have the budgets in their libraries to be able to manage this kind of thing. So to provide access to their researchers. So research done in Africa for Africa is being hidden in a way because of a lot of these barriers. So this is the World Conference. The 7th World Conference was in June 2022. And it became really quite clear that there was a huge amount of interest in the fact that we were going to put together a statement around fairness in research. And as you can see, we had Professor Tuli Madonsela as one of the keynote speakers. And a lot of interest this is from Nature, from Science, around this topic, helicopter research comes under fire at Cape Town Conference. The statement was eventually published not via an article in Nature, and the article, I think, is not the statement. So the article highlighted aspects of the statement, but it was very nice to get it published as a commentary article in Nature. And it certainly has meant that there's been a lot of focus and attention on it and the issues that have been raised by it. So I'm not going to go into this. So the article, it's just important that the article is not the statement. The statement, and I'll show you in the next couple of slides, is available on the World Conferences of Research Integrity Foundation webpage. But the article focused on various things, layers of injustice, that much too often researchers and institutions from high-income countries reap greater benefits from global collaborations than do their LMIC collaborators. Not always the case, but certainly I think historically it has been. The increase around diversity and inclusivity that is needed, that funders need to actually include these stipulations in calls for grant applications. I think we've obviously gone completely in the reverse when it comes to anything coming out of the US now, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. And I think for both of our institutions, UCT and Stellenbosch, we know that we're going to have to start looking increasingly elsewhere for funding, and hopefully these kind of the importance of diversity and equity in research by funders that aren't sitting in America will still be emphasized. So yeah, I think this was that there was a section around encouraging fair practice in research, and it's an interesting article, and I think it's a good way to read it prior to actually reading the full statement. Other key points were around infrastructure, discouraging parachute and helicopter research, recognizing indigenous knowledge, and then global equity for global problems, emphasizing that in order to actually tackle some of the really big problems of that the planet finds itself in, that we actually need a diverse group of people to look at these problems. And sorry, I'm not reading this out because I've got this block that I can't minimize for some reason, which is obstructing the text. But I will let you have the slides afterwards. So the Cape Town statement is published on the World Conference of Research Integrity Foundation website, and you can download it either as a full statement or as a poster, which is, it looks like this as a poster. And so let's just go back a bit. It basically has 5 groups of values, and then there are a number of statements, not an equal number, but a number of statements under each of those 5 groups. And so there are 20 points altogether. And most of them are quite practical. They're really trying, it's a call to action to everything from researchers to research producing institutions, to funders, to journals and publishers, to say these are the issues that you need to look at around fair practices in research. So I'm drilling down a little bit, but I'm only going to really focus on the ones that are particularly aimed at researchers. So the first group of values under the first group is diversity and inclusivity as a pathway to fair practice and attribution. Researchers should recognize the value of collaborating with colleagues from different disciplinary, geographical, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds, and strive to achieve this diversity, especially when doing research in contexts and environments that are different from their own. And I think that's just so important. I think, we've had ethical issues that have caused a huge amount of, I can think of one at Stellenbosch, and certainly one at my institution, that have got lots of bad press in the local press, and also and in both instances, I think it was because research groups or research people were doing research without perhaps understanding the sensitivities and in particular cultures. So they were coming as outsiders and looking at a problem, and therefore landed up with conclusions that were seen to be quite stigmatizing, and in some cases even quite racist. So that's one of the first things that I think is really important. Then under fair practice from conception to implementation, all research stakeholders should be aware of potential power balances in their research collaborations and ensure their actions do not exacerbate them, but rather contribute to removing these imbalances. And that, I've heard so often that these power imbalances sit under the table and they're there and everyone knows that they're there. They're not actually surfaced and they can sometimes have a very negative impact on the research. There's also a statement here about that I've emphasized, that journals and publishers should adjust page costs for authors from low resourced environments. And that definitely has, I'm quite interested in open science and have been following the progress over the last years. And there certainly is momentum gathering, to realize that this is a big issue and that it needs to be rectified as much as possible. And then the third group of values is mutual respect as a pathway to trust. And I've got all of these in blue. So research priority and agenda setting should include all research partners. HRC research agendas should not be imposed on LMIC collaborators. Research teams should identify mechanisms to enable planning and budgeting that minimize power and opportunity imbalances in teams and makes roles explicit early. Full cost transparent budgeting is really important. And then data use, sharing and access and openness requirements should not unfairly disadvantage LMIC collaborators. The fourth group of values is shared accountability. And that is trying to encourage LMIC governments to actually recognize that they really do need to fund local research. I'm not sure that this has had much of what effect that it's happening. But we know in our own country that we seem to have be going in the opposite direction there. But one hopes that the statement will, over a period of time, gain a bit of traction. And then a statement to remind HR research producing institutions that when collaborating with researchers from low resource settings, they should ensure their researchers engage in fair practice and where possible, appropriate they should contribute to local capacity development and strengthening of research management systems and processes. And then the last set of values was around indigenous knowledge and recognition and epistemic justice. And I think just all of these are really important, that making sure that indigenous knowledge is not exploited, that researchers and peer researchers, and in the Nature article, we had a specific example about how you can have researchers in communities that don't have degrees or haven't had a tertiary education, but can become part of a research team and can be incredibly valuable, and that their contribution should be acknowledged. And in the Nature article, there was an example of that where it was around rooibos tea production, and in the authorship line were at least two peer researchers, so not academic researchers at all, but community-based researchers. And then also emphasizing that in co-creation of indigenous-led knowledge, that you have to have respect and appropriate benefit sharing. So that's the statement. I also just wanted to, and I actually meant to include another slide, but I wanted to make you aware, if you're not aware, of the African Charter for Equitable Partnership, because I think it's also an important document. It has a lot of synergy with the Cape Town Statement. It is a far more academic document. I think it came out of more of I think ours came out of a more research management perspective, whereas this is very much was led by academics in humanities. But it has a huge amount of value, and it's definitely worth Googling it and downloading it and having a look at it. And I think there are certainly projects around implementing it in more practical ways as well. So I'm ending off now. Sorry, I've been talking probably longer than I anticipated, but last two slides is just some practical recommendations. I think one would be to improve diversity in your own internal collaborations and encourage your institution to develop policy in this regard. I think we're already doing very well at both of our institutions for this. So in a way, it's a statement that's also, talking to a broader audience. I think it's important to only collaborate when the benefit is clearly mutual and where you will have a voice, and to preferably join a collaboration prior to the development of the research agenda and the proposal stage. And I think I mentioned this already. I mean, there's EU funding, EU. It was Horizon 2020, but now the new wave of EU funding, they always want, and especially in my field in research integrity and ethics, these big consortiums get put together and the grants get written and the proposal is written, the budget is all sorted out. And then I think on at least 3 occasions, I have then been approached to join because there's a need to have, a LMIC collaborator. And I think in the beginning, I would be very eager and very happy that I'd been approached. But, I have got to the point where, unless it's really something that's really going to be worthwhile for us and my colleagues and the projects that we're working with here, it sometimes is better just to say, I'm sorry, but no. So especially if you're getting a very short end of a budget. And then work to develop long-term collaborations that extend beyond the life of one project and make this intention clear. Be forthright in collaborations and use tools. I'm going to talk about the Association of Commonwealth University Toolkit, which is on the next slide, which has a whole lot of things that will help you surface power imbalances in collaborations. I think it's really important to make all roles and contributions explicit. Having a one-day kickoff workshop that facilitates these kinds of sometimes quite hard conversations, I think, is really important. Obviously, publish open access as much as possible, and leverage the Cape Town Statement and other open science initiatives to negotiate better page costs. This is just an example of it's freely downloadable. The Association of Commonwealth Universities has a toolkit where it gives you all kinds of things, all kinds of exercises. So Equity Cafe, recognizing and assessing assumptions, multiple perspectives on equity, matrix ranking, a whole lot of tools all around equity and collaboration. So I encourage you, especially if you're working in big research collaborations and consortiums with foreign funding, to actually have a look at this toolkit because there's a lot of great value in it. And then lastly, I think some more practical recommendations is to discuss authorship arrangements, the beginning of a collaboration, and develop publication plans that are signed off by everybody, full cost and fair budgeting, data access, data management plan that all collaborators sign off on. And also, I think reciprocity is very important to LMIC researchers. So capacity development should not be a one-way street. And I think capacity development programs must benefit everyone in the team, and everyone needs to contribute. And we, in an LMIC researchers, have an awful lot of value that we can share with our HIC collaborators. And then the last one is recognition, fair benefit and recognition of indigenous knowledge and local contribution is essential, and making sure that this is brought to the forefront early in your collaboration, if that is appropriate. So I think that was my talk. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Lyn. Especially just for sharing those recommendations that are listed in the Cape Town Statement. I think it makes it such a useful tool or guide just to think through how we can facilitate equitable partnerships, not just with international collaborators, but I think also in terms of locally, I mean, interinstitutional collaborations as well. I think these are principles and recommendations that could be useful for any kind of collaborative project across any level. And I'm just thinking about our day-to-day, how our day-to-day operational decisions can create certain maybe unintentional, unequitable, and unfair research relationships that we do not particularly think about from the start or before we make those decisions. Then I don't see any questions in the chat. Malian was kind enough, thank you, Malian, to post that, to note that fortunately there are funders like, for example, the British Academy, who are actively promoting equitable research partnerships. And there's currently, it's called the Call to Action. So thank you for sharing that, Malian. And then just to note that we've also shared the website of the Ninth World Conference, and there you'll find the information on the previous World Conferences as well, and all the different statements. I wonder, colleagues, is there anyone who would like to share or share their question or comment live? You are welcome to do so. Your microphones can now be muted, and you're welcome to switch your camera on as well. Okay, I think if I can use my chairperson privilege, then I was wondering, especially in terms of with our Office for Research Integrity and Ethics, and of course, you mentioned research managers and how central research management offices are in just touching on the various points or factors that could make or break equitable partnerships. And I'm wondering, as officers of research integrity and ethics, as perhaps a practical way that we could support our researchers. I'm thinking about a case specifically a few years back where one of our emerging young researchers were involved in what I considered an unequitable collaboration. But of course, the researcher was already in it. The agreements have been signed and decisions have been made, and it was too late then to advocate for a more equitable partnership on their part. I just wondered if you have any advice or thoughts.
I think, if I think of the education and training that we do, even despite the fact that, our Office of Research Integrity, that the Cape Town Statement came out of that. I mean, we don't do much around how to have an equitable collaboration. What are some of the pitfalls? And, one could actually easily do a whole workshop and create online content in order to that Association of Commonwealth Universities toolkit has got amazing stuff in it. And most people are not aware that it is even out there. And it can really help. And so, I think, developing a kind of a program that we can have on an annual basis around research collaborations would be really, really useful. I mean, the other thing is that I'm sure your researchers are finding as much as is the due diligence requirements for funders are arduous and so I mean, you know, we're so difficult to sometimes respond to, and and I mean, to me, that's a big fairness issue. And I guess it's because, you know, we are all risk averse and we're financially risk averse, and funders want to get the best value out of, you know, out of there. But I think sometimes if more than one university gets together and and pushes back a bit to say, look, you know, in our context, we really feel that that some of these due diligence requirements that you're asking of us, I mean, yeah, I suppose I shouldn't mention specific funders, but you know, around like revealing research misconduct, not even if somebody's found guilty, but just if somebody has had an allegation against them, you know, those are things that I feel funders are overstepping. Although that's not such a, I suppose that's not an equity thing, but it is an equity thing in a way, because I feel it's imposed by an HIC funder on LMIC countries, that there seems, and sometimes the level of checks and requirements that I think are, you know, are increasingly very arduous. But and also perhaps, you know, trying to persuade these funders that they need to actually put aside some, so that you can't just ask all laboratories to be green certified and not provide any funding within your research grants to help researchers in LMIC countries to get to a green certification. So it's those kind of things that are being imposed sometimes, you know, yeah, with great difficulty in our often resource-strained environments.
Thank you, Lyn. Colleagues, if there's any other questions, yay, Malian, please go ahead.
Hi, Lyn.
Hi, Malian.
I was wondering whether you've used some of the ACU toolkit components yourself, because I had a closer look at it earlier this year, and they're good tools, but I would recommend anybody who wants to use it to first practice with it in a smaller group, because they especially if like me you haven't had social science training.
Yeah.
You have to be able to deal with people getting to know each other on a very, very frank, open level.
Yeah.
And yeah, and speaking about things that might be difficult.
Yeah, I think that they are very, you know, I haven't actually been in a research collaboration space where I've used them. I've certainly looked at them, but I think that some of them would be, and obviously they are coming out of a more humanities type environment.
Yes.
And sometimes I think would really benefit from being used with a facilitator.
Yes.
So, you know, that would be, if you are going to use some of these in a kickoff meeting, then to be able to find some budget to actually have a facilitator who is good at this kind of thing, to be in the room, and also a neutral person, so you don't have, you know, you have a neutral facilitator who can help keep these conversations on, you know, on track, and have a good outcome of them.
Yeah.
And not have everybody you know, at the end feeling worse off than at the beginning, which is obviously not what one needs.
Yeah. Thanks
very much. Thank you for that question, Malian. And I see, Lyn, I see a comment from Dr. Liesel Smith saying, thank you for organizing the session. I had the privilege to engage with Prof Lyn last year when she presented in the D43 RCR session at the Tygerberg campus.
Yes.
So there's some, Yes, so thank you so much,
Thanks
Lyn.
very much for that.
I think then, colleagues, we can close the session. Thank you, Lyn. Thank you so much for just the thought-provoking presentation. And it's important for us to often think about, especially like you've mentioned, in this climate, how can we practically facilitate and put these recommendations in place in our research teams. And I just want to thank all of you for for joining us. I know that it's quite a busy time at Stellenbosch right now, so thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you can take what the takeaways that you've learned here, that you can take it back to your research teams. Thank you very much, Lyn.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Clarissa. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks. Bye.